I'm delighted to be here this evening, and thank you to Aware for the invitation. And I was speaking to Deirdre just before I started. Before I took on this role in alcohol action and around alcohol harm, I worked for Samaritans for 6 years, and I worked with Aware during that period. And I always think it's important to acknowledge it's wonderful the work that's been done around mental health and where we are now in terms of stigma. It's still a lot to do, but we've come so far in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. But I think it's really important to acknowledge organisations like Aware who have been so instrumental in doing that, and also were there, 20 years ago when it wasn't quite such a subject that attracted so much attention. So I'd just like to acknowledge that and the work of the organisation. As I said, I'm now working for Alcohol Action Ireland, so a little bit about me to start off with and the organisation. I'm not a clinician. I realise a lot of these lectures have been given by doctors and clinicians before. My background is in social science and social policy, and AAI itself does not offer a service. It's a campaigning and advocacy group. So our role really is to work with doctors, frontline treatment people, with epidemiologists and people working in research, to take all this information and put it out to key audiences to influence people to bring about change. So that's really the purpose of the organisation. So I'll talk a little bit about what we do. I'd also like to look at the negative effect of alcohol on mental health, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, but we include some really relatively recent statistics in this which are quite interesting. What needs to be done in the social context to address this? So not so much in the personal context, but more in the societal context. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about why 2015 is such an important year for alcohol harm, because you may not be aware of it, but the Public Health Alcohol Bill has been announced and is due to be enacted this year. The Oireachtas Health Committee are currently having hearings on that, on submissions on it at the moment, this week and next week. And so it will be the first time that in this country that alcohol harm has been addressed on a legislative footing and from a health perspective. This is really a little bit about what the charity does. As I say, we're about advocacy, and you could encapsulate the work we do by saying we work to reduce the burden of alcohol harm. I think the important point there is really to look at here is that we work on evidence base, which I think is very important and not always the case. This is just a sample of some of the work we do. The central piece there is a submission on alcohol sponsorship of sport. The lady had her baby in Holles Street and she was supporting our alcohol and pregnancy bill, and that's just Alistair Campbell, who's a mental health campaigner in the UK, and Catherine Byrne, TD, who are involved in a cross-party group on alcohol harm in Leinster House. Now, just looking here at what the problem is. Again, some of you may be aware of this, some of you may not. Just as a top-line figure, alcohol consumption in Ireland has doubled since the 1960s, and the harms associated with it have doubled since the 1960s. You'll see a couple of dips there in recent peaks and troughs. I can't really see from here, but this is about 2008 when the recession hit. And here, this is 2008. And here, these other dips are when excise was applied. So what this graph illustrates to people who are anoraks around alcohol is that when price is a factor, consumption goes down. And you'll see that a little bit later on. In terms of controlling alcohol harm, price is really, really important. But what's not on that slide, and the figures were announced just about a week ago, is the levels of alcohol consumption for 2014. Now, we have seen we peaked in 2001 when we were drinking, per capita consumption of alcohol in Ireland was 14.1 litres of pure alcohol. That was the peak, and that was obviously during the Celtic Tiger. Not unrelated to that was a peak also in terms of deaths by suicide and self-harm. So those things are not unrelated. You'll see there was a dip with the recession, a plateauing out, but the 2014 figures indicate that our consumption has risen again, and we're now at 11 litres. The recommended level for alcohol consumption, I wouldn't say recommended, but what we're aiming for at the moment, looking at our European neighbours, is about 9.2. But that's bearing in mind that the European region is the highest alcohol consuming region in the world. So we're measuring ourselves against quite a high consumers, but still 9.2 would be a realistic target for people to meet. And unfortunately, we're going in the opposite direction. And the notable increases were in the area of wine, a 6.9% increase in wine and 4.2% in beer. So, and this occurred, which is quite interesting, despite a 5% decrease in the population 20 to 29 years, which is between 2013 and 2014, that's usually quite a heavy drinking category of people, and it's most likely through emigration that those people have left. So you can see that the pattern, as an economic recovery is kicking in, that the alcohol consumption is beginning to go up again, and the harms will go up in line with that. Now, 2 years ago, the Health Research Board, which is, I'm sure, a body you're familiar with, there's a lot of public health research in this country, a state-funded body, did the Irish Alcohol Diaries, which was a very big piece of work asking people themselves about their alcohol consumption. And this is probably one of the most recent research which has driven all the discussion around binge drinking, because one of the difficulties in Ireland is that it's not so much the amount we consume which is significant, it's the way we consume it. We tend to be more people who save up all our allocation of drinking for Friday and Saturday night and go for it in one big session, rather than having a glass of wine each night or a couple of glasses of wine with a meal at a weekend. So you can see there that the headline piece there is that 75% of alcohol consumption was done as part of a binge drinking session. 51% of women started drinking before the legal age of 18. That's really, really important, because we have a very high tolerance of underage drinking in Ireland. And this is one of the challenges we face when we talk about underage drinking, because underage drinking really affects people's physical and mental development, particularly impactful on the adolescent brain. The adolescent brain really doesn't it doesn't mature until people are into their early 20s. And so taking on large quantities of alcohol when kids essentially are at that age, they're just not mature enough to cope with it. And that can have a very detrimental impact. And it's one of the big challenges for us, because the drinking patterns of Irish people have changed in the last 15 to 20 years. So one of the challenges we face is that policymakers are a bit like me. They're in their 40s and 50s. And so they'll cast a nostalgic glow on their own teenage years when they perhaps had a couple of pints or lagers behind the back of the shed. Drinking amongst adolescents is not like that anymore. Drinking amongst adolescents now is about shots, it's about spirits, it's about all sorts of drinks mixed together. It's about drinking at home, before going out, it's about drinking after going out, after parties, where drinking is completely unchecked and unregulated. And so that type of experience for adolescents is extremely negative, and it drives all sorts of issues, but it particularly drives mental health issues, and particularly in young men. And so that's the importance, and that's the sort of information that's hidden in those statistics. The other one I draw attention to here is dependent drinking is highest amongst the 18 to 24-year-old age group. Why that's concerning to us is because that is the group that's targeted most heavily by the alcohol advertising. And so from a sales perspective, if you're selling any product, people tend to make a lot of their brand loyalty decisions when they're quite young. So if you sort of develop an affinity with a product at that age, you're more likely to stick with it for about maybe 10 or 15 years before you change your habits again in mid-30s. And so that, therefore, is quite an important statistic. Sorry, I'll just flick back there. You can see at the bottom this stat here. 1.35 million harmful drinkers in Ireland. Now, that's really, really important, because sometimes when we talk about alcohol misuse, we tend to conjure up a picture of sort of a homeless person, or somebody drinking out of a brown paper bag, somebody who's addicted or an alcoholic. But actually, a large number of people are drinking harmfully and are unaware of it. And the reason they're unaware of it, again, as I've said before and will say frequently, is we are very tolerant of alcohol in Ireland. You'll often hear people saying, well, sure, everyone has an alcoholic in the family, and that's probably true. But what that does is it normalises heavy drinking, and we all sometimes can't see the wood for the trees. And it takes outsiders to come to the country and remark on our relationship with alcohol. But the actual statistics indicate that is the level of harmful drinking in our society, and it's not small. It's not a small number of people, it's a large number of people. So how did we get here? Well, as I said earlier, in the last 15 to 20 years, our relationship with alcohol has changed. And partially that is driven by the fact that alcohol now is really cheap, it's very heavily marketed, and it's widely available. When I was in college, which is a peak drinking period for Irish people, the holy hour was still in place. So even if you wanted to sit in a pub all day, you couldn't, because it closed at about 2 o'clock and you had to leave. Also, alcohol was quite expensive. If you were on a student budget, you couldn't afford it. It's actually cheaper now than it was 25 years ago when I was in college. It's much more heavily marketed, and the availability is, there's practically nowhere you can't buy alcohol at this point. And all of these things drive consumption. There's a very interesting study coming out of Glasgow where it indicates that there is a direct correlation between the amount of cirrhosis of the liver in a community and the number of off-licences in that community. So these factors are really, really important in driving people's consumption. These are the figures that we work on. And this is the evidence base, really, that you look to try and influence preventative policies. So from a health economics point of view, there's just a massive cost associated with this. Even if you didn't care about the human cost, the economic cost is absolutely enormous. The growth in liver disease, the 3.7 billion figure, which includes public order offences, criminal justice problems. I mean, the courts are a litany of alcohol-fueled crimes. And then the very sad issues, particularly around mental health and self-harm, we'll get to those, the cancer risk and the liver disease. And I think what is really frustrating, I suppose, for people like us is that we talk a lot about these harms. The doctors talk a lot about these harms. The medical colleges talk about it. The epidemiologists talk about it. The National Office of Suicide Prevention talks about it. But it's very, very difficult to effect any change. And it's quite difficult to challenge that normalisation and the fact that people kind of characterise people who are concerned about this as being sort of spoil sports and kind of boring, puritanical types. This is not about banning anything. It's not about prohibition. It's about understanding what a low-risk relationship with alcohol is and how to have that. Now, this is a slightly complicated slide, courtesy of Dr. Bobby Smyth. What this really basically shows you is how the drinking age, when children, and I say that word advisedly, children start to drink in Ireland, the age is dropping. I think that's 2011, it was 15, now it's 14. And each year, this year, about 66,000 children will start drinking, which is a pretty shocking statistic. Children shouldn't be drinking in the first place. The underage drinking rule 18 is not some sort of quaint custom. It's there for a reason. It's there for the protection of children, because alcohol essentially is a psychoactive substance. It needs to be treated with caution, and it needs to be something that adults consume in a regulated environment. So just going through this, I'm trying to pick out something that's particularly... The Irish children have been reporting drunkenness in Irish children has been... There was a report from Temple Street the other day, I think some of you may have seen it, about the number of children under 12 who've been admitted to Temple Street. Children under 12 really don't, they don't want to drink. They are drinking because they are exposed to parental behaviour or they're exposed to alcohol itself. And that's why they end up drunk. I don't think there aren't many 10 or 11-year-olds who'll decide that they want to go out for a drink. It's just because they're exposed to it. It's an environmental issue for them. And from that perspective, that's enormously worrying. Now, I have to stress that the number of 11 and 12-year-olds who will be admitted to hospital for drunkenness is actually quite small. There shouldn't be any, but it is quite small. But the real harms are in the 16-plus age group, when kids are getting a little bit older and they're getting a little bit more independence. But they tend to be getting involved in a regular sort of pattern of harmful drinking, and that's where the damage is largely done. This is the My World survey from Headstrong. I'm sure you're probably familiar with Headstrong, the great work that they do, but this is a very comprehensive survey about young people's lives and in the context of mental health. But you can see here that just under half of all sixth-year students and 60% of young adults report excessive drinking. This is sort of a little bit about what I'm talking about. As kids get older, and particularly in this new online digital environment, they're getting increasingly exposed to alcohol. They grow up in an alcohol-saturated society. So you can't, although you will hear that there's a lot of regulation around alcohol, it's hard to see where it is. It's very easy to get drink underage here. I mean, adults buy drink for children, give it to them, go into off licences, give it to them. This research done by the Ballymun Drugs Task Force. Adults are buying alcohol and off licences for young children, giving it to them. Kids are able to order online. A van will come round to their house and deliver slabs of alcohol. So, although there are restrictions in place, they're not really enforced, and they're not actually that. There's no real sanctions attached to them. Again, this is a slightly complicated slide about, but what all these three slides are is that people who are drinking, young people in particular, are more vulnerable to anxiety, depression, and stress. And that really sums that up. So the more you drink, the more vulnerable you are during your teenage years. And again, this slide is just really reinforcing what I'm saying, is the fact that we talk in Ireland about, we accept that young people drink as something as this bit of crack and a rite of passage. That day is gone. The rite of passage day is gone, because the quantities that they are drinking, we were doing some work with the College of GPs, and the alcohol lead there spoke about a patient who came into her surgery, and she asked him, he was 25, asked him to recount what he had drunk on an average Saturday night. And, without sounding sort of very, very middle-aged and appalled by the youth of today, but he recounted that he had taken 6 shots, 4 or 5 beers and a bottle of wine. And that was an average night for him. Now, that's a huge amount of alcohol. And that was all consumed at home before he went out. And so he was setting out into that. So you see where the problems are arising here. And I'm not sure whether Bobby Smyth has ever addressed this group, but he speaks very eloquently, he's an adolescent psychiatrist, about the impact of alcohol on the adolescent brain, particularly the foreshortening of thinking. So essentially what he would experience is that young men in particular are drinking quite a lot. We know that when people binge drink that it depresses their self-protection, self-preservation instinct. And what can happen is that these young men can be something happens. The girlfriend dumps them. There's a fight. There's something, and their reaction to that in a drunken state can be impulsive, and it can take on the form of self-harm, perhaps taking their own life. And these impulsive acts, these suicidal impulses, which can be very quick, are fueled by the fact that a huge amount of alcohol has been taken on board, and alcohol is interacting with the adolescent brain in a way that it simply doesn't with a more mature person. And this is, we know certainly in terms of in all the suicides in Ireland, that alcohol is a factor in over half of them. And people sort of have a complex approach to suicide and self-harm. Sometimes there can be an acceptance of, well, if somebody's going to kill themselves, they'll do it anyway, which is, of course, completely incorrect, and that alcohol is just some sort of enabler. But I think we need to challenge that the fact is that for many people who take their own lives, particularly young men, that they just wouldn't do it if they weren't drunk. And therefore, for me, that's a very strong argument, in fact, a bulletproof argument, for making sure that alcohol is regulated so that people who are vulnerable and people who are young are protected from it, protected from the potential the harm that it can do to them whilst they are young, until they are older, more mature, able to cope with it, and in a regulated environment. And you can see here from this slide, it's the adolescent brain, just really underlining the fact that the adolescent brain really doesn't mature until it's 20. And that's, again, something that's not often considered in the context of when people should start drinking. These are slides from a campaign that we recently ran with the Union of Students in Ireland. You may be aware that, I think if we flick back there, we can see that 18 to 24 age group is really a very vulnerable one in terms of harmful drinking. In fact, the students initiated themselves. They worked for a long time with the alcohol industry in the guise of Drink Aware, but they had intense dissatisfaction with that relationship because they didn't feel that it was credible or that it was meaningful in terms of its impact. So we worked with them, along with National Lottery funding, people from the HSE, to devise a campaign that we thought would be impactful. The students themselves, who are this age group, are very, very aware of their mental health, which is really brilliant. They're very literate in terms of mental health, and they understand the risks and they understand the harms, but it's very difficult to change their behaviour. So this is a campaign that is a sort of a third-party campaign where we try to highlight the harms and also the influence that older siblings have on younger siblings in terms of repeating their behaviour. But what went with this campaign was it's still underway, is the development of brief intervention training around alcohol for the counsellors on the campuses. And so what that enables people to do is the student counsellors, who are dealing with a whole range of issues for students, are trained to offer brief intervention, which is really a measure where it just asks people about their drinking, reminds them of what their allowances are each week. The standard drinks 11 for women, 17 for men, 2 alcohol-free days per month. And also takes a glass, not dissimilar to that, and asks someone to pour out a standard drink, because very few people know what a standard drink is. It's 10 grams of alcohol. It's a lot less than people realise. And that's one of the challenges of work like ours, is to get across these health messages. I'm not sure, does anyone in the audience, would they be confident that they were pouring out a standard drink? I'd be delighted if somebody was. But it's an important piece of information that we need to get out to people, to empower people to take responsibility around their physical and mental health. You have to know what low-risk limits are. if you're going to introduce them into your lifestyle and take control of your own health. So campaigns like this are to attract attention, to inform people, but the real behaviour change comes through policy and regulation. So these are about changing attitudes of young people who are exposed to a huge amount of alcohol advertising. When they get into college, the atmosphere very much is one of almost celebrating heavy drinking. I mean, I think some of you who were following the media reports during February possibly would have heard some students referring to February being drinking month in college campuses. And with rag weeks and these sort of concentrated events, which are very alcohol fueled, there have unfortunately been a number of tragedies in those areas. But we do see the universities trying to take a lead on this, and UCC in particular has a very strong student health programme, and alcohol or reduction and knowledge around alcohol harm and regulation around alcohol is a big part of that. And I think we'll probably see more and more of that. These are some of the key messages that I think I've covered already in terms of what was in that mental drinking campaign, but simple messages to try and break the normalisation of alcohol, but also the celebratory thing we have going on in Ireland about alcohol. It's very difficult for us to say to our children, you shouldn't be drinking, when their parents are drinking in a harmful manner. And equally, when we bring sort of everyone to breweries and to pubs, VIPs when they come to the country. Like there's a lot to Ireland apart from beer, and there are many, many things to celebrate. And we're not saying that shouldn't happen at all. The alcohol industry makes a big contribution in terms of employing people, but certainly there are other aspects to our culture I think we need to highlight and to celebrate. We complain, and St Patrick's Day is coming up next week, of course, and we do complain a lot about being characterised as the drunken Irish, but we do sometimes characterise ourselves as the drunken Irish, and I think we need to be careful about that, because language and symbols around this are quite influential in terms of our culture around drinking. And lots of people would say to me, you'll never change the culture around drinking. But actually, we have changed cultures before, and the obvious ones, obviously, we changed the culture around smoking with the smoking ban, and we changed the culture around drink driving. But that cultural change came about as a result of regulation. Now, lots and lots of people will say to us it's about education, but actually, if you want to make a change in behaviour, it's about regulation. But the difficulty is not everybody welcomes regulation. So I thought it might be useful, possibly I'm preaching to the converted here, but I think it might be useful just to run through the impact of alcohol, particularly on people's mental health. I think point 3 there, which I probably didn't articulate particularly well earlier on, is about the reduction of people's inhibitions. And as I say, having worked with Samaritans, this is a particular concern to me. I spoke to a lot of bereaved families. I saw a lot of people bewildered about why young people did things that seemed so out of character. And, this reduction of inhibition around post-binge drinking is something I think that people don't fully understand or appreciate. And I think it's a really, really important thing to highlight, that people are doing things they possibly may not have done had alcohol not been a factor. And I think the other point here, the second point that illustrates here is important. You don't have to be drinking an outstanding drinker, as it were, to have these impacts. It can happen. Your reaction, particularly as a young person, to alcohol may not be as predictable as you think it is. And I think that's... and finally, all these are backed up by the World Health Organization, saying that if you're abusing alcohol, the risk of suicide is 8 times greater than people not abusing alcohol. And I think it's very important, again, coming to the preventative piece. Again, there's been a tremendous amount of work done in this country around self-harm and suicide, and lots more to be done. But we focus to a great extent sometimes on treatment, which is incredibly important. But I think also it's very important to prevent these problems as well, where you can. And that does 2 things, and it lifts some people out of the problem altogether. It also frees up services and resources to treat people better who do need treatment. And I think they're important points. In 2013, some of you will recognise Professor Ella Arensman from the National Suicide Research Foundation. Ella spoke among a number of other mental health specialists at our conference in 2013. We call this Facing the Fear. I mean, you'll all be familiar with the expression of the fear, which people talk about on a Sunday usually. I'm feeling the fear today. It's sort of a form of heightened anxiety, normally after a late night. And it's kind of it's an open joke in Ireland that people are having the fear today, and it makes you paranoid, a little bit anxious, worried about what you did last night, if you had blackouts and so on and so forth. And we really wanted to challenge the fact that although this sometimes is quite amusing, the reality is you're talking about a self-induced state of anxiety. This is not a good thing to be doing, and it's not... it's not in any way healthy, and it should not be celebrated. Ella had done some very interesting work on the rates of self-harm among young people and adults in Ireland, and again, this is not an area that's probably gets the full examination that it deserves in the public debate. You can see here the direct effects of alcohol abuse. I mean, I think these are worth looking at individually. Impairs problem-solving ability, increases impulsivity and lack of control, increases feeling of depression, stress, anger, and anxiety. Now, if you put all of those together, you can see that somebody is faced with a problem that to you and I is probably, or a person who's feeling fit and well and resilient, is not really that important. But if you're in a diminished state like that, your problem-solving ability is reduced. Put together with impulsivity, put together with feelings of anger, anxiety, you can see where that can sometimes lead to acts of self-harm, and it's a very, very dangerous mix. And I think it's important to alert people to that, both as individuals and as parents and family members, that this is not risk-free activity. You're drinking alcohol to excess, and the long-term and indirect effects are slightly less dramatic, but equally undesirable. Again, these are the stats, these are the conference findings. What should be, we know that suicide is a leading cause of death in young Irish men, and alcohol is a factor in 41% of self-harms. This is interesting, this third point here, particularly coming up to St. Patrick's weekend. Alcohol causes increased rates of self-harm at specific times of the year. So what Ella is basically saying here, that there's a consistent pattern of self-harm admissions to hospitals after bank holidays and weekends. And that is, I think that's a very important finding, indicating again that this indulgence in alcohol is not risk-free. It has direct fallout, it is measurable fallout, and self-harm, for people to be self-harming as a result of alcohol misuse is absolutely crazy, and something we really, really do need to address. You can see here the recommendations that reducing heavy drinking will reduce self-harm, the high rates of alcohol abuse in people over 40 who have taken their own lives, and the trends around highly lethal methods of self-harm, particularly around young men. I mean, none of this is good. It's incredibly important that the work that the National Suicide Research Foundation are doing to highlight these harms, because it's this type of information that it's really, really important, informs the debate about mental health, because we talk a lot about talking, which is really, really important. We talk about diminishing stigma. We talk about the need to seek help and the provision of help, and that's all incredibly important. But prevention is also equally important, and it's about empowering people to realise that you can prevent these things. There's not an inevitability about it. As you kind of recover from episodes of depression and anxiety, equally you can prevent or reduce your risk of them occurring in the first place. And I think that's a really important message. Again, this is a stat around the methods, the lethal methods of self-harm. This is all available on the National Suicide Research Foundation. They produce regular updates and information around self-harm, which are actually definitely worth a look if it's an area of interest to you. It is a growing area, and it's also an area that's really underreported. You probably all have seen the iceberg image where you show the levels of self-harm that are reported largely through A&E or emergency departments, and then that large sort of hidden amount of self-harm that at this point is estimated that isn't actually being recorded. So these were the outcomes of that particular conference, and you can see here that these outcomes are very much around public policy, and we don't often think public policy is not a gripping area, but it is very effective in terms of changing behaviours. So you can see here we talked about the minimum unit price of alcohol. I'm not sure whether anybody is familiar with the minimum unit price of alcohol, but what that is it's about setting, and I'll speak a little bit about the legislation in a moment. Minimum unit pricing is about setting a floor price beneath which alcohol can't be sold, and what that would essentially do is eradicate the super cheap alcohol you see being sold in supermarkets. And cheap alcohol is bought by young people and vulnerable people. So people who are heavy drinkers and people who are underage buy cheap alcohol. They're almost entirely driven by price. And the cheaper it is, the more they're likely to buy of it and drink of it. And so that's why people who work in this field are very focused on price. And the minimum unit pricing is a very targeted measure, because if you drink in a low-risk manner, you won't even notice it. But if you drink in a high-risk manner, it will inhibit your spend on alcohol. And that's unfortunately what needs to happen. Again, this point here about alcohol and advertising and marketing, I haven't spoken about that so much. The ban on the alcohol sponsorship sport, major brands of sponsoring major events, is probably one of the most contentious parts of this whole alcohol harm debate. People generally think they're not affected by advertising. We all think that we're immune to advertising, we can see through it. And I mean, that's recognised in the literature and known as the third-party effect. I think why people focus so much on sport really is because there's quite a large number of children. Obviously, we encourage children as part of the Healthy Ireland strategy, which is the government's strategic plan for the health of the nation for the next few years. The encouragement is to get people involved in activity, in sport. It generally has a positive and beneficial effect on us. And for young children, it encourages them to go into sport and take up physical activity as part of their life. And many of them look up to sporting heroes as heroes. The difficulty occurs when those heroes in those games are used as a vehicle to promote alcohol. Because what that does is it puts alcohol in the child's mind. They associate it with sporting success, and that's really how advertising and sponsorship works. Sponsorship also allows alcohol brands to get around some of the regulation. The regulation around advertising in Ireland is fairly weak, but where it does exist, sponsorship allows you to circumnavigate that. And probably the best example of that is in Ireland, there's a voluntary code around sports sponsorship, and in that code you're not allowed an alcohol brand can't sponsor a sports bulletin. So if Des Cahill comes on to talk about the rugby or the GAA, what he can't say is that an alcohol brand is bringing you this news bulletin. But what Des does have to then report is that he's reporting on, say, the rugby, which is the Guinness Pro 12, and he has to name the sponsor as part of that. And that's how that circumnavigates the voluntary code. Brand recognition is a big part of people's decision to buy a particular brand, but also it's introducing alcohol to children at a very young age. I mean, if we were to turn the clock back, obviously alcohol will be approached in a very different way. It's too fully integrated into our society now to try and attempt to do that. We can't change. We are where we are, to coin a phrase, but we do need to really challenge our acceptance of the fact that lots and lots of young children are looking at sports people and are exposed to alcohol advertising, particularly online, particularly around music sponsorships and things like that, and what impact that's having on them and their attitude to alcohol. Again, we're speaking about the availability, and of course, this piece here, services providing treatment and counselling to people with alcohol-related issues should be enhanced. Most of the treatment services in the last few years have taken cuts to their funding of over a third, which is really, really difficult for any services to sustain it. And during that period, people have the demand on those services continue to grow, and it just doesn't fit. And again, these regulatory measures, will lift the pressure off the health services. I mean, every night, 1,500 beds in Irish hospitals are given over to people who are there because as a result of alcohol misuse. And that's quite, if we were to free up those beds alone, that would really lift the burden off the health service. So, but this little piece here at the end, I flicked forward there. There are a huge number of people who require treatment who are not getting adequate levels of treatment to help them recover. And that's something that shouldn't be overlooked. Again, I seem to be quoting Bobby a lot in this particular talk, but this is someone who is, as you can see, a child and adolescent psychiatrist, very much working on the front line of alcohol harm, and this is what he thinks what needs to be done. We mustn't ever underestimate the impact of advertising, of availability and cheap alcohol in our society, and the impact that has on young people, normalising them and easing them into a life of drinking when they should really be stopping it. They shouldn't be starting so young, and they should, from the word go, understand what a low-risk relationship with alcohol is. Some of the things that I think most of the things that I've outlined here this evening seem very obvious. When you look at the level of harm, the clinicians, the epidemiologists are very clear on what needs to be done. So we have to ask ourselves, why hasn't this happened sooner? And of course, the problem is that we come from a public health perspective, and not everybody comes from a public health perspective. And the alcohol industry, where making a huge economic contribution to our society in terms of jobs and in terms of tax, and that has to be recognised, and an entirely legitimate industry, does also have quite a significant influence on public policy. And that is something that we feel is inappropriate. The World Health Organization made a statement, I think about 2 years ago, to say that the role of the alcohol industry has absolutely no role in public policy making, because simply it is, like many other industries, it has a vested interest. Its first interest is to its shareholders, quite rightly, and those shareholders need to see a profit. And I've just highlighted, these are some examples. I mean, Drink Aware is an industry body. The current campaign, Stop Out of Control Drinking, is an industry-funded body. But this is the Taoiseach here, as you know, and this chap here is Ivan Menezes, who's the CEO of Diageo. Now, this man is very important because he's a very straight talker. He's come to Ireland on a number of occasions, very successful man, and he's very honest about his position and what he wants to see here, and I entirely respect that. This was at the opening of something in James's Gate. And what he said there is that alcohol in Ireland is too expensive, it has to be cheap. And he wants to see cheap alcohol, and I absolutely respect his desire to see that for the interests of his company. However, cheap alcohol comes at a massive cost to Irish people. Now, business people generally don't like regulation, that's absolutely fine. It's the role of the government to protect the interests of the citizen. All commercial actors and interests will try to protect their own commercial interests. That's just the way of life, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it does require the government to stand up to those commercial interests when they intrude on the interests of the individual and the citizens and the well-being of the state. Most organisations doesn't really affect them at all. Most businesses, but if you're in the area of sugar, alcohol or tobacco, the product you're selling has the potential to do harm to citizens, and therefore it needs to be regulated. Nobody is saying industries need to be shut down, but they definitely do need to be regulated, and they definitely have no role in putting together public health policy. But as you can see, they actually can be quite active in that area. They tend to favour things like education, which is largely ineffective. What works in terms of changing behaviour is regulation, and as I mentioned earlier, we've seen that several times before. The reason there's so much activity in the area of alcohol at the moment is the Public Health Alcohol Bill. I'm not sure whether any of you have heard of it or have any interest in it, but it was announced last month following an extensive period of consultation leading to, in 2012, the recommendations of the steering group on the National Substance Misuse Strategy. These are the measures of the bill, which are some of the things I've spoken about: minimum unit pricing to eradicate cheap alcohol, regulation of marketing and advertising, so young people in particular are protected from alcohol advertising, structural separation. That means that alcohol, reflecting the fact that alcohol is not a grocery, it's not a standard good, it's not something you need to always have in your grocery basket. It should be in a separate area, sold separately, to reflect the type of product that it is, that it needs to be regulated, and there needs to be some sort of control and separation about how it is sold. This one here is very interesting, health labelling about alcohol products. Those of you who are watching their weight or on a constant diet like me probably spend a lot of time looking at products, and you can turn around and see the calories, see the salt content, the fat content. You can't do that with alcohol products at the moment, and that really is an anomaly. You know, people talk a lot about personal responsibility, but you have to equip people with information to allow them to be personally responsible. And so the health labelling piece, which will come in, will be really useful, because on the labels of the bottles or any container in which alcohol is sold, there will be information about the amount of alcohol in terms of standard drinks or grams of alcohol, which will allow people to calculate what their low-risk limits are for that particular week or a period of time. And this is quite interesting as well. We have had on the books, I think most people in Ireland probably agree, and we know from the Health Research Board that there is a huge level of support amongst Irish people for the government to regulate around alcohol, because I think everyone feels the harms on a day-to-day basis. But one of the problems is we've had, since 2008 in the Intoxicating Liquor Act, we've actually had the facility to ban those price-based promotions, the sort of, you know, the messy Mondays and all this type of thing. But they were never commenced. And part of the reason that legislation was never commenced was there was no enforcement mechanism for it. And so this introduction of enforcement powers being given to the environmental health officers means that they will be able to, what we're calling for is the immediate commencement of those bans on price-based promotion, which are quite dangerous, you know, 2-for-1s, all of this type of thing. You see a lot of it around student bars around Temple Bar, those sort of places, you do see that type of promotion, but it's all over the country, really. When enforcement measures are available, then we would suggest that those measures come in, because there's a lot of evidence to support that promotions drive, price-based promotions drive overconsumption and harmful consumption. What I'd like, if you're interested in this and you support these measures and you're concerned about alcohol harm, we'd really like you to make your voice heard and join. This is a campaign page we have. Ourselves and our colleagues in the Royal College of Physicians have set up an Alcohol Health Alliance to garner support for this. But please take a look at this page. You can contact your TD to say whatever you like, but you can basically say that we would like the TDs to support this bill. One of the interesting things about alcohol harm is that I often ask groups of people like this is, if you are concerned about alcohol harm, and so many people contact us have you ever contacted your public representatives about it? And most people haven't, because they don't see it really as an issue worthy of sort of, people tend to contact TDs about more personal issues. But of course, this is a very personal issue because it impacts on almost every one of us. But I would encourage you to talk to them. The legislators are very engaged around this. We hold briefings for Oireachtas members on a regular basis, and they're all very engaged with this issue. They understand the harms. Challenging for them because they are lobbied very heavily for the industry to weaken the measures in this bill, and that's just political life. Sectoral interests will always lobby. We lobby for public health. Industry lobbies for the alcohol industry, and that's the way political life operates and legislation works in a democracy. But what I would suggest is, if you are interested about it, please do add your name to these campaigns, because that's when TDs appreciate the fact that people are concerned about this and they want something done about this. I'll just close almost with this quote, because again, we hear, if you talk about alcohol, you'll hear a lot about the nanny state, you'll hear a lot about personal responsibility, you'll hear a lot about small numbers of people ruining it for everybody. But I think this is quite an interesting quote along around the whole area of willpower and personal responsibility. And I'll give you a chance. I won't read it out, but you can certainly see here that, this really sums up really well how difficult it is to build resilience around your physical and mental health in Ireland and in wider society. People tire of always trying to do the right thing for their mental health, for their physical health. We were given the information and we trot out to try and do all those things to protect our health. But if you're in an environment that mitigates against that, it is virtually impossible unless you have Olympian levels of self-discipline, which most of us don't. And what we're suggesting through the regulation, through the work we do, is that we work hard to create a society that it's actually easier to do the right thing for your health. And I did some work a few years ago with a guy called Professor Steve Platt, who's some of you may know. I think he's done some work with Aware in the past. But he spoke about the importance of mental health proofing our society, that mental health issues shouldn't just be in the ghetto of health. They should be, we all have mental health and we all live in the society, and everything we do, every interaction we have, everything we undertake can affect our mental health. And that mental health proofing, part of that is regulating the things that impact on our mental health. And alcohol harm, in fact, impacts very negatively on mental health, and particularly on the mental health of vulnerable people. So we need to take the steps that protect those people. Mental health, one of the measures to mental health proof our society, to make it an easier place to be resilient and to protect people who are less resilient. And I think that's just a really interesting concept, and it's something we should really be trying to aim for. As I said, we all need the power, the information, and that's really one of the reasons I came to talk to you tonight, is to give people the information. It can be difficult to get this level of detail. There isn't much advertising about low risk limits and high risk limits and what they are and standard drinks. So I appreciate it's very difficult for people to navigate that. We live in a society that sort of not only normalises alcohol, it really celebrates it. So what we're trying to do by having these talks and discussions to people who are motivated around issues around mental and physical health is to inform them so that they too can go out there and make the right decisions for themselves and for their families. The thing I'll conclude with really is the fact that I would urge you to go onto the HSE website, onto our own websites, drugs.ie, various other websites, where you get the information on what low risk limits are. And one thing I would remind you of, that often people talk about how much you should be drinking, they talk about recommended amounts of alcohol. There are no recommended amounts of alcohol. There is no safe limit of alcohol consumption. There is only low risk and high risk. And if you take only one thing away from that, is to inform you that there is just low risk and high risk, and understand what low risk is and understand what high risk is. And when you're equipped with that information, then you're beginning to protect yourself from alcohol harm that may be happening to you inadvertently. And if we'd be delighted if you joined the campaign, but I'd be even more delighted if you took that information on board and used it as something to build your own personal resilience around your own personal mental health and the mental health of others and the physical and mental health of yourselves and others. So thank you very much.